August 12, 1943. Pearl Harbor. The morning heat already pressing down on the concrete docks. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Taussig stood in the planning room of the Pacific Fleet headquarters, staring at aerial photographs of Tarawa Atoll. The images showed a thin strip of coral and sand, barely wider than a city block in places, surrounded by a reef that extended hundreds of yards from shore. He was 34 years old, a naval officer whose career had been built on understanding how ships moved through water. Now he faced a problem where water itself was the enemy. The photographs came from reconnaissance flights conducted over the past 3 weeks. They showed the reef at different tidal stages. At high tide, the water over the reef measured 3 to 4 feet. At low tide, it dropped to 18 inches in places, sometimes less. The landing craft that would carry Marines to the beach, the standard Higgins boats, drew 3.5 feet of water when loaded. The mathematics were simple and catastrophic. If the tide was wrong, the boats would ground on the reef 500 yards from shore. The Marines would have to wade through chest-deep water under direct fire from Japanese positions. Taussig had seen the casualty projections. They were classified, but he had clearance. If the landing craft could not reach the beach, the estimates ranged from 40 to 60% casualties in the first wave. That meant thousands of men cut down in the water before they could fire a shot. The planners called it acceptable losses. Taussig called it murder. He had been assigned to solve this problem 6 weeks earlier in late June. The assignment came from Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious forces in the Pacific. Turner was a hard man, precise and demanding. He had given Taussig a single sheet of paper with the problem written out in neat handwriting. Find a way to get Marines across the reef at Tarawa regardless of tide conditions. Timeline. Operation Galvanic launches November 20th. That gave Taussig 14 weeks. The solution existed, but it was not a naval vessel. It was called the Landing Vehicle Tract, or LVT. The Marines called it the Alligator. Taussig had first seen one during a demonstration at Dunedin, Florida in May 1941, more than 2 years earlier. The vehicle was a rectangular metal box mounted on tank treads, powered by a truck engine. It could drive into the water like a boat, then crawl up onto land like a tractor. The inventor was a man named Donald Roebling, who had designed it to rescue people from hurricanes in the Everglades. The demonstration had been impressive in a swamp. The LVT had churned through sawgrass and mud, crossed a canal, and climbed up a sandy bank without stopping. But it was not a military vehicle. It had no armor. It carried only 20 men. Its top speed on water was 4 knots, barely faster than a man could swim. The Marine Corps had purchased a small number for logistics work, moving supplies from ship to shore, but no one had considered using them to carry assault troops. Taussig requested the specifications and performance data from the Bureau of Ships. The files arrived 3 days later. The LVT-1, the current production model, weighed 15,000 pounds empty. It measured 26 feet long and 10 feet wide. The hull was made of 1/4-inch steel plate, enough to keep water out but not bullets. The engine was a Hercules WXLC-3, a 6-cylinder gasoline motor that produced 146 horsepower. The treads were made of manganese steel, designed for swamp muck, not coral. The vehicle could carry 4,500 pounds of cargo or 18 combat-loaded Marines. In water, It was propelled by the treads, which acted like paddle wheels. On land, it could climb a 3-foot vertical obstacle and cross a 5-foot trench. The fuel capacity was 120 gallons, giving it a range of 150 miles on land or 75 miles in water. The crew consisted of 3 men: driver, assistant driver, and rear crewman. Taussig made a list of problems. First, the LVT had no protection. A rifle bullet would punch through the hull. Machine gun fire would turn it into a sieve. Second, there were not enough of them. The entire production run to date was 200 vehicles, scattered across training bases and supply depots. Third, they were not designed for assault. They had no ramps, no weapons mounts, no communication equipment beyond a hand-cranked siren. He calculated the requirement. Tarawa was a regimental, Marines in the first 3 waves. Each LVT carried 18 men. That meant 278 vehicles just for the assault waves, plus reserves for casualties and breakdowns. Call it 350 vehicles minimum. The current inventory was 200, and most of those were already assigned to other operations. He needed to find or build 150 more LVTs in 14 weeks, then modify all of them for combat, then get them to the Central Pacific, then train crews to use them under fire. Taussig wrote a memo to Admiral Turner outlining the requirement and the timeline. He hand-delivered it on August 14th. Turner read it standing at his desk, his face expressionless. When he finished, he looked at Taussig and said, "Make it happen." He signed the memo and handed it back. That signature gave Taussig the authority to commandeer resources, redirect production, and override normal procurement channels. It also meant that if the plan failed, Taussig would be the one explaining why to the families of dead Marines. The first step was production. The LVT was manufactured by the Food Machinery Corporation, known as FMC, at their plant in Dunedin, Florida. Taussig placed a call to the plant manager, a man named John Calargiz. The conversation was brief. Calargiz said the plant was running at full capacity, producing 10 LVTs per week. To produce 150 additional vehicles in 14 weeks would require more than doubling output. That meant more workers, more steel, more engines, more treads. It also meant overtime, night shifts, and priority access to materials that were already allocated to other war production. Taussig contacted the War Production Board in Washington. He used Admiral Turner's name and the classified designation for Operation Galvanic. The board granted priority status for steel and rubber. That meant FMC could requisition materials ahead of other manufacturers, but it also meant someone else's production would be delayed. Taussig did not think about that. He thought about Marines wading through the reef. The second problem was armor. The LVT-1 hull could not stop bullets. Taussig needed to add protection without making the vehicle so heavy it could not float. He consulted with Lieutenant Commander John Erskine, a naval architect at Pearl Harbor. Erskine calculated that they could add up to 2,000 pounds of armor before the vehicle became unstable in water. That was enough for quarter-inch steel plate on the sides and 3/8 inch plate on the front. The armor had to be fabricated and installed. There was no time to send the vehicles back to Florida. Taussig found a welding contractor in Honolulu who normally repaired merchant ships. The contractor had a crew of 40 welders and a yard with overhead cranes. Taussig showed him a drawing of the LVT with armor plates marked in red. The contractor said he could do it, but he needed steel. Taussig found the steel at a salvage yard near the harbor. It was plate from a merchant ship that had been torpedoed and beached. The ship was being scrapped for metal. Taussig bought the entire hull section for the price of scrap. The welders cut the plates to size using acetylene torches. They drilled holes for bolts and welded brackets to the LVT hulls. The work was done outdoors in the sun with temperatures over 90 degrees. The welders wore leather aprons and face shields. Sparks flew in orange arcs. The smell of hot metal and welding flux hung in the air. Each vehicle took 2 days to armor. Taussig watched the first one being completed on August 28th. When they lowered it into the water for testing, it floated 6 inches lower than before, but it floated. The third problem was weapons. The LVT had no armament. Taussig wanted to mount machine guns on each vehicle so the crews could suppress enemy fire during the approach. He requisitioned 50 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns from the Army depot at Schofield Barracks. The Army supply officer refused. The guns were allocated for anti-aircraft defense. Taussig went over his head to the depot commander, a colonel named Harris. Taussig explained the situation. Harris made a phone call to Pacific Command. An hour later, Taussig had his machine guns. The guns were mounted on pedestal mounts welded to the front of each LVT. The mounts allowed the gun to traverse 180 degrees and elevate to 60 degrees. The gunner stood behind a shield made of half-inch armor plate. Ammunition was stored in metal boxes bolted to the hull. Each vehicle carried 600 rounds of .50 caliber in belts. The installation added another 400 pounds, but the vehicles still floated. The fourth problem was crews. The LVT required specialized training. The driver had to operate the vehicle in water and on land, shifting between modes without stalling the engine. The assistant driver operated the bilge pumps and monitored fuel and oil pressure. The rear crewman managed the cargo area and helped Marines disembark. Now there was also a gunner. That meant 4 men per vehicle, all of whom needed to train together. Taussig established a training program at Kahului, Maui. The site had a beach with a coral shelf similar to Tarawa. He brought in 30 LVTs and assigned Marine crews from the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion. The battalion commander was Major Henry Drews, a career Marine who had served in Haiti and Nicaragua. Drews understood the stakes. He drove his men hard. The training began on September 3rd. The crews practiced launching from ships, forming waves in the water, and driving onto the beach in formation. They practiced at night, using only moonlight and compass bearings. They practiced under simulated fire, with instructors shooting live ammunition over their heads. They practiced emergency procedures, what to do if the engine failed, if the vehicle took on water, if the driver was hit. Taussig observed the training from the beach. He watched the LVTs churn through the surf, treads throwing spray, engines roaring. They climbed onto the coral shelf without slowing, treads grinding over the rough surface. On land, they pivoted and turned, surprisingly agile for their size. But they were also slow and loud. The Japanese would hear them coming from a mile away. One of the crews had a problem. The vehicle stalled in the water 50 yards from shore. The engine would not restart. The crew tried the hand crank, but the engine was flooded. Waves pushed the vehicle sideways. It began to drift down the coast. Drews sent another LVT to tow it back. The crew was soaked and shaken. Taussig made a note: add backup ignition systems. The fifth problem was logistics. The LVTs had to be transported from Florida to Hawaii, then from Hawaii to the Central Pacific. The vehicles were too large to fit in standard cargo holds. They had to be loaded on deck, exposed to weather and salt spray. Taussig coordinated with the Naval Transportation Service to allocate space on cargo ships and LSDs, landing ship, tank, which had large open decks. The first shipment of 50 LVTs left Dunedin on September 10th, loaded on the deck of a cargo ship bound for Pearl Harbor via the Panama Canal. The voyage took 3 weeks. When the ship arrived on October 1st, Taussig inspected the vehicles. The salt spray had corroded exposed metal. The engines needed to be flushed and serviced. The treads had to be checked for rust. It took a week to make the vehicles operational again. The second shipment was delayed. A hurricane struck the Florida coast on September 15th, flooding the FMC plant. Production stopped for 4 days. Callergis called Taussig with the news. Taussig asked if the vehicles already built were damaged. Callergis said no, they were stored on high ground. But the delay meant the shipment would not leave until September 25th. That put it in Pearl Harbor on October 18th, only a month before the invasion. Taussig recalculated the timeline. The vehicles had to be armored, armed, tested, and loaded onto LSDs for the final leg to Tarawa. The LSDs would leave Pearl Harbor on November 1st as part of the invasion convoy. That gave him 2 weeks to process 50 vehicles. It was possible, but there was no margin for error. The sixth problem was communication. The LVTs had no radios. Once they launched from the ships, there was no way to coordinate them or change the plan. Taussig wanted to install radios in at least the lead vehicles of each wave. He requested 30 SCR-300 backpack radios from the Signal Corps. The radios were in short supply, allocated for infantry units. Taussig argued that the LVTs were the first wave, and without communication, the entire assault could fail. The Signal Corps agreed to provide 10 radios. Taussig took them. The radios were installed in waterproof boxes bolted to the hull. The antenna was a whip mounted on the rear deck. The operator sat next to the driver with the handset clipped to his chest. The range was 3 miles, enough to reach the command ship offshore. The crews practiced radio procedure during training, using call signs and code words. The lead vehicle of the first wave was Red 1. The second wave leader was Blue 1. The command ship was Flagship. Taussig tested the system during a night exercise on October 10th. He stood on the beach with a radio, listening to the crews report their positions as they approached. The transmissions were clear at first, then broke up as the vehicles entered the surf. The noise of the engines and the spray interfered with the signal. Taussig made a note: crews must report before entering the surf zone. The seventh problem was fuel. The LVTs consumed gasoline at a high rate, especially in water. Each vehicle carried 120 gallons, enough for 75 miles in water. The distance from the ships to the beach at Tarawa was 12 miles. That left enough fuel for the return trip, but not much margin. If the vehicles had to circle or wait offshore, they could run out of fuel before reaching the beach. Taussig proposed a refueling plan. The LVTs would launch from the ships with full tanks. After delivering the Marines, They would return to the ships for refueling, then make a second trip with supplies. The refueling would be done from drums on the ship's deck, using hand pumps and hoses. It was slow and dangerous, gasoline on a ship under fire, but it was the only way to keep the vehicles running. He briefed the plan to the ship captains on October 15th. They did not like it. Gasoline on deck was a fire hazard. If a shell hit the drums, the ship could explode. But they understood the necessity. They agreed to store the drums in the least exposed areas and have fire crews standing by. The eighth problem was maintenance. The LVTs were mechanical vehicles operating in the worst possible environment: salt water, coral, sand, and combat. They would break down. Taussig needed spare parts and mechanics who could repair them under fire. He established a maintenance section within the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, staffed by marine mechanics trained on the LVT. They carried toolboxes, spare treads, engine parts, and welding equipment. The mechanics practiced repairs during training. They replaced a thrown tread in 20 minutes. They swapped out a damaged engine in 2 hours. They patched a hull puncture with a steel plate and underwater epoxy. Taussig watched them work with satisfaction. These men would keep the vehicles running when it mattered. The 9th problem was timing. The invasion was scheduled for November 20th at 8:30 hours. The LVTs had to launch from the ships at 600, form up in the water, and hit the beach in 3 waves at 5-minute intervals. The timing had to be precise. If the first wave was late, the second wave would bunch up behind them. If they were early, they would arrive before the naval bombardment lifted, and the ships would fire on them. Taussig worked with the operations staff to create a detailed timeline. The LVTs would be lowered from the LSDs starting at 5:30. Each vehicle took 3 minutes to launch. With 50 vehicles per LSD and 3 LSDs in the first wave, that meant 150 vehicles in the water by 600. They would form up in a line 1,500 yards from shore, then advance on signal from the command ship. The signal was a green flare. When the flare went up, the first wave would start moving. The second wave would launch 5 minutes later, the third wave 5 minutes after that. The naval bombardment would lift at 8:25, giving the first wave 5 minutes to cross the final distance. It was tight, but it could work. Taussig rehearsed the timeline during exercises. He stood on the deck of an LSD with a stopwatch timing each step. The crews were slow at first, fumbling with the launch cables and starting the engines. By the 10th rehearsal, they had it down. The vehicles hit the water on schedule, formed up in neat lines, and advanced in unison. Taussig felt a flicker of hope. The 10th problem was the unknown. Taussig had studied every reconnaissance photo, every intelligence report, every map of Tarawa. But he had never been there. He did not know what the coral would do to the treads. He did not know how the Japanese would react. He did not know if the vehicles would hold together under fire. He was sending men into battle in machines that had been designed to rescue people from swamps. On October 20th, the final shipment of LVTs arrived in Pearl Harbor. Taussig had his 350 vehicles. They were armed, fueled, and crewed. The training was complete. The logistics were in place. The timeline was set. All that remained was to load them onto the LSDs and sail to Tarawa. The loading began on October 25th. The LVTs were driven onto the LSDs in single file, treads clanking on the steel ramps. They were parked in tight rows, secured with chains and chocks. The crews stowed their gear and checked their weapons. The LSDs were crowded and hot, smelling of diesel fuel and sweat. The Marines tried to sleep, but the anticipation kept them awake. Taussig inspected each LSD before departure. He walked through the rows of LVTs, checking the armor welds, the fuel tanks, the machine guns. He spoke to the crews, asking if they had questions. Most of them were young, 18 or 19 years old. They looked at him with a mixture of confidence and fear. He told them the vehicles would get them to the beach. After that, it was up to them. The convoy left Pearl Harbor on November 1st. Taussig sailed on the USS Ashland, an LSD carrying 50 LVTs and their crews. The voyage to Tarawa took 18 days, sailing southwest across the Pacific. The weather was good, the sea calm. Taussig spent the time reviewing the plan, checking equipment, and talking to the crews. He wanted them to trust the vehicles, to believe they would survive. On November 10th, the convoy stopped at F8 in the New Hebrides for final briefings. Taussig attended a meeting with Admiral Turner and the assault commanders. They reviewed the plan one last time. The LVTs would carry the first 3 waves. The Higgins boats would follow with the 4th and 5th waves, assuming the tide was high enough. If the tide was low, the Higgins boats would wait offshore and the LVTs would make additional trips. Turner asked Taussig if the vehicles were ready. Taussig said yes. Turner asked if the crews were ready. Taussig said yes. Turner looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. The meeting ended. Taussig walked back to the Ashland in the dark, listening to the sound of the waves against the hull. The convoy reached Tarawa on November 19th, the day before the invasion. The ships anchored 12 miles offshore, out of range of Japanese coastal guns. Taussig stood on the deck of the Ashland and looked toward the island. It was a thin line on the horizon, barely visible in the haze. Somewhere on that line, Japanese soldiers were waiting in bunkers and trenches, their guns aimed at the reef. That night, Taussig did not sleep. He went over the plan in his mind, checking every detail. He thought about the things that could go wrong: engines failing, treads breaking, vehicles swamping in the surf. He thought about the Marines who would ride in those vehicles, trusting their lives to his plan. He thought about the families who would receive telegrams if the plan failed. At 400 on November 20th, the crew of the Ashland began preparing the LVTs for launch. They removed the chains and chocks, started the engines, and checked the fuel and oil. The noise was deafening, 50 engines roaring in the enclosed deck. The exhaust fumes made the air thick and choking. The crews climbed into their vehicles, adjusting their helmets and checking their weapons. At 5:30, the first LVT was lifted over the side by crane and lowered into the water. The vehicle hit with a splash, rocking in the swell. The driver engaged the treads and the vehicle moved away from the ship, churning through the dark water. The second vehicle followed, then the third. One by one, the LVTs entered the water and formed up in a line. Taussig watched from the deck. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a pale gray line above the horizon. He could see the shapes of the LVTs in the water, black rectangles with white wakes. They looked small and fragile against the vast ocean. He counted them as they launched: 50 from the Ashland, 50 from the next LSD, 50 from the third, 150 vehicles in the first wave. At 600, the vehicles were in position. Taussig could see them through binoculars, lined up in 3 rows, engines idling. The crews were waiting for the signal. The command ship fired a green flare. It arced into the sky and burst in a bright emerald star. The first wave started moving. Taussig watched them advance. The vehicles moved slowly, making about 4 knots. The distance to the reef was 12 miles. At that speed, it would take them 3 hours to reach the beach. But the plan called for them to arrive at 8:30, which was only 2.5 hours away. Taussig realized the timing was off. The vehicles were slower than expected, probably because of the added weight of the armor. He grabbed a radio and called the lead vehicle. "Red 1, this is flagship, increase speed." The response came back through static. "Flagship, Red 1, engines at full throttle." Taussig swore under his breath. The vehicles were already going as fast as they could. They would be late. He called the command ship and reported the problem. The operations officer said they would delay the naval bombardment to give the LVTs more time. Taussig felt a knot in his stomach. Delaying the bombardment meant giving the Japanese more time to prepare. But there was no choice. The LVTs had to reach the beach before the bombardment lifted, or the Marines would be caught in the open. The sun rose at 6:30, flooding the ocean with light. Taussig could see Tarawa clearly now, a low strip of green and brown surrounded by white surf. The reef was visible as a dark line in the turquoise water. The LVTs were halfway there, still moving in formation. The naval bombardment began at 700, the big guns on the battleships firing in sequence. The shells screamed overhead and exploded on the island, sending up columns of smoke and debris. At 800, the LVTs reached the reef. Taussig watched through binoculars as the first vehicle climbed onto the coral. The treads bit into the rough surface and the vehicle kept moving, water streaming from the hull. The second vehicle followed, then the third. They did not stop. They did not ground. They crawled over the reef like the alligators they were named for. Taussig felt a surge of relief. The vehicles were working. The plan was working. The Marines would reach the beach. But then the Japanese opened fire. Machine guns and rifles from the shore aimed at the slow-moving targets on the reef. Taussig saw the water around the LVTs erupt in splashes. He saw tracers arcing across the reef, red streaks in the morning light. He saw one vehicle shudder and stop, smoke pouring from the engine. The crew belayed out and took cover behind the hull. The other vehicles kept moving. The gunners on the .50 caliber machine guns returned fire, raking the shore with long bursts. The noise was continuous, a roar of engines and gunfire. The LVTs reached the beach at 8:30, right on schedule despite the delay. The rear ramps dropped and the Marines poured out, running across the sand toward the Japanese positions. Taussig watched the second wave launch. 50 more LVTs entered the water and started toward the reef. They passed the disabled vehicle from the first wave, still smoking on the coral. The crew was waving, signaling they were okay. The second wave reached the beach at 8:35. The third wave followed at 8:40. By 900, 450 Marines were ashore, delivered by the LVTs. The Higgins boats tried to follow, but the tide was low. They grounded on the reef, just as Taussig had predicted. The Marines had to wade through the water and the Japanese cut them down. The casualties were horrific. But the first 3 waves, delivered by the LVTs, had established a foothold. They held the beach and pushed inland. Taussig stayed on the ashland for 3 days, coordinating the LVT operations. The vehicles made trip after trip, carrying marines, ammunition, water, and medical supplies. They evacuated wounded on the return trips, loading stretchers into the cargo area. The crews worked without rest, driving through the surf under fire. Several vehicles were hit and destroyed. Several crews were killed, but the vehicles kept running. On November 23rd, Tarawa was declared secure. The island was taken, but at a terrible cost. Over 1,000 Marines were killed and 2,000 wounded. The casualty rate was 20%, lower than the projections for a reef landing, but still devastating. Taussig walked the beach after the battle. The sand was littered with debris, shell casings, equipment bodies. The LVTs were pulled up on the shore, battered and scorched. Some had holes punched through the armor. Some had treads blown off. But they had done their job. Taussig wrote a report on the LVT operations. He documented the performance of the vehicles, the effectiveness of the armor, the problems with timing and communication. He recommended improvements. Better engines, more armor, better radios, ramps on the front as well as the rear. He sent the report to Admiral Turner and to the Bureau of Ships in Washington. The report was read by planners preparing for future operations. The LVT had proven itself at Tarawa. It had solved the problem of the reef. It had delivered Marines to the beach under fire. It had changed the way amphibious assaults were conducted. The Navy ordered more LVTs, thousands of them, in improved versions with the changes Taussig recommended. The LVT was used in every major amphibious operation in the Pacific after Tarawa. At Kwajalein, at Saipan, at Guam, at Peleliu, at Iwo Jima, at Okinawa. The vehicles became the standard method for landing assault troops on hostile shores. They enabled the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces across the Pacific to Japan. Without the LVT, those operations would have been far more costly, perhaps impossible. Taussig was promoted to commander and assigned to the staff of Admiral Turner. He continued to work on amphibious operations, refining tactics and equipment. He was present at the landings on Saipan in June 1944, watching the LVTs crawl ashore in waves, just as they had at Tarawa. He felt a sense of pride, but also a weight. He knew that every vehicle carried men who might not come back. After the war, Taussig returned to the United States. He was awarded the Legion of Merit for his work on the LVT program. The citation read, "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services to the government of the United States as officer in charge of landing vehicle development and training." His initiative, resourcefulness, and tireless efforts were instrumental in the successful employment of amphibious vehicles in combat operations in the Pacific Theater. Taussig did not talk much about the war. When asked about the LVTs, he said they were just machines. The real heroes were the Marines who rode them into battle, but those who served with him knew the truth. Without Taussig's work, without his 14 weeks of relentless problem-solving, the Marines would have waded through the reef at Tarawa. Thousands more would have died. The island might not have been taken. The war might have lasted longer. The LVT was a simple machine, a box on treads. But in Taussig's hands, it became a weapon that changed the course of the war. He saw a problem that others accepted as unsolvable. He found a solution that others dismissed as impractical. He made it work through sheer determination, improvisation, and refusal to accept failure. He did not invent the LVT, but he made it into what it needed to be. He turned a swamp-buggy into an instrument of victory. Taussig retired from the Navy in 1946 with the rank of captain. He lived quietly in Virginia, working as a consultant for defense contractors. He died in 1981 at the age of 72. His obituary in the Navy Times mentioned his service in the Pacific, but it did not mention the LVTs. Most people who read it did not know what he had done. But the Marines knew. The men who rowed the Alligators across the reefs of Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima knew. They knew that someone had cared enough to find a way to get them to the beach alive. They knew that someone had worked day and night to build the machines that saved their lives. They knew that someone had refused to accept that they were expendable. That someone was Joseph Taussig, a naval officer who faced an impossible problem and solved it. A man who turned logistics into a lifeline. A man who understood that behind every machine, every plan, every operation, there were human lives at stake. He did not seek glory. He sought solutions. And in doing so, he changed the nature of amphibious warfare and helped win the war in the Pacific. The LVTs are gone now, replaced by newer vehicles, but the principle remains. The idea that you do not leave men stranded under fire. The idea that you find a way, no matter how difficult, to get them where they need to go. That idea came from Tarawa, from the coral reefs and the withering fire, from the moment when Joseph Taussig looked at a problem and refused to accept the easy answer. He chose the hard path, the path of innovation and improvisation, the path that saved lives. That choice echoes through every amphibious operation since, a legacy written not in monuments but in the survival of men who made it to the beach.